So, Martymer responded. Let's see what he has to say.
Yeah, that does surprise me since you're a theist. The idea that a god can be natural seems contradictory to me, so clearly you must have a rather unusual understanding of what a god is, or perhaps what nature is.
Yes, I do in both cases, but that's the fun part about idealism. See, the idea with substance dualism, and by extension with classical theism, is that there is a necessary divide between the natural and supernatural, and thus between the material and the immaterial. But on idealism, you can either say that everything is natural or that everything is supernatural, because the distinction is blurred away entirely. Everything is still governed by scientific laws, though.
One refers to measurements, which are simply physical interactions between systems, the outcomes of which depend on some property of at least one of the systems. The other refers specifically to our perceptions.
Okay, so from what I gather, you're saying that our perceptions are only a subset of the set of all measurements. This is fair enough. After all, I do agree that things like photodetectors and cameras can make measurements too. But with respect to each individual mind, the photodetector's wave function does not collapse with respect to you until your particular mind collapses it, at least if we are to take QM to its logical conclusion. However, I want to point something else out here that I pointed out in Wigner's friend's quantum mind. Our perceptions are subjective sensations, i.e., qualia. But now if we agree nature is all there is, then a substance dualism between mental and material cannot exist. But if we are to say that some measurements are mental while others are not, then we are positing a substance dualism to explain a distinction between measurement and perception. This is not, of course, to say that all measurements are our perceptions, but it is to say that if some measurements are qualia, and there is no natural-supernatural dichotomy, then all of the other measurements must be qualia also, even if they are not qualia in our minds. So if we are to reject substance dualism, there should be no ontological difference between what a perception is and what a measurement is. And thus, if we are to reject substance dualism, the building blocks of the mind, aka conscious perceptions, should be quantum.
One also refers to the state of the system, and the other to its existence.
But the state of the system is what exists, right? Of course, one is dealing with a scientific question and the other is dealing with a philosophic question, but at the end of the day, it's the same natural existence you're studying, right?
Johannan, the definitions are right there. You wrote them down yourself. They're different. If you can't see that, then we really can't make any progress on this issue. Physical reality is not the same thing as the state of a quantum system. Look, A. Physical reality exists. B. In physical reality, there exists an unobserved quantum system Q. C. Q exists in a distinct state S. I can reject C without rejecting A or B. I don't see how this is so hard to understand.
Okay, I think I see the issue here, and if I do, then we are not disagreeing as much as we think. I would define something as having physical reality if that something has defined physical properties, and by physical properties I mean distinct values of space-time, energy, or matter. Prior to collapse, the system does not have these properties, though, and so I would say on my definition of the word physical that B is incoherent. But it appears that we are operating on different definitions of the word physical here. You, of course, would define physical just in terms of what we can study scientifically, which would also include things prior to collapse that do not have definition in space and time. And so you would define things before collapse as physical. This gets into the whole issue of Hempel's dilemma as to where the physical stops and the metaphysical begins. Taking Hempel's dilemma into account, I would say that the wave function in the system before measurement is beyond the physical, whereas you would not. And so on my definition, if C goes, then so does A. But of course, in terms of the math, it doesn't really matter, because we are still describing both pre- and post-collapse, or what I would think of as sub-physical and physical in terms of natural laws. So at the end of the day, it appears we are only having a semantic disagreement here.
First of all, how do you know that?
Because things that don't have defined locations in space and time don't exist in space or time. And I use the concept of a hard drive as a metaphor for not in space-time. Before collapse, things do not have defined locations in space and time. That just stems from the definitions of what space and time are. You can't make sense of a space-time without locations. For example, a center of an empty universe where no particles have locations is both everywhere and nowhere. In fact, that's why some quantum gravity models like CET triangulate space-time into existence from pre-space, which, of course, I would define in my own semantics as sub-physical. That's also why people like Fotini Markopoulou say that space-time is not fundamental but emerges from information.
Second, it sounds like you're making a claim about the nature of objective reality, and you don't believe objective reality exists, if I understand you correctly. The claim that reality works like this, or in any other way for that matter, presupposes philosophical realism, which you reject. Am I missing something here?
Yes, you are, but that's okay. I should have been more careful to parse philosophic realism before. As I said in my previous video, I believe in structural realism. I just don't believe that this is any more than a structure of thoughts or information. So no reality exists beyond the stuff of subjective perception. However, subjective experience itself is a different sort of reality of its own. Namely, it has a defined structure that can be studied and measured, much like how a sim can study the effects of the lines of code in a Sims game.
I never claimed that hidden variables exist. In fact, as you know, having watched the video, I actually state that I believe that they in fact do not exist.
Okay, fair enough.
This is something that really disappoints me. I can't tell if you're intentionally making fallacious appeals to authority and quote mining, or if you just don't understand the problem here. What an expert says must be taken in the appropriate context. When explaining a model, it may sound as though the expert is asserting as fact that the model accurately describes reality, but what he's actually saying is this is how reality works according to this model. You also have to consider that this is an area where the experts have not yet reached a consensus regarding which model best describes reality, and pretty much all of them will say so straight out if asked. This is why context is so important.
Yes, context is important, and yes, we do not as of yet have a full quantum gravity theory. However, the context in this particular case is that both major camps of quantum gravity are reaching the same conclusion now regarding space-time being emergent from information. In fact, if you read Lee Smollen's 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity, he seems quite unequivocal about space being illusory and emergent from information in the final picture. So regardless of which theory turns out to be right, it will still be a theory wherein physical space-time is emergent.
And sound bites from documentaries are horrible for just this reason. We don't get to hear the actual question given by the interviewer, and it's also edited, so we only get the bits that fit in with the flow of the narration.
Alright, fair enough. I will say though that this is why I upload lots of videos that are just interviews or panels from experts without me editing them. If you want, you can peruse some of these when you have time. Now yes, talks are dumbed down, and this is unfortunate, but if I want to popularize this to the general audience, I don't have much of a choice.
We can turn this into a game of my expert can kick your expert's ass and look for quick quotes that allow us to say, look, this expert is on my side even though he's merely describing a possible model. But that's hardly going to get us anywhere.
Well, that would certainly be funny to watch, especially if there are large numbers of fans on either side involved. That said, I suppose I'd have to agree with you there. However, might I suggest that instead of looking at this in terms of sides, that you look at the quantum gravity research and tell me if you think spacetime is emergent yourself?
That would depend on what you mean by real. Yes, it would be a simulation, but it would be a real simulation. Yet in the fictional reality of the Matrix movies, Neo was in the Matrix, and this was true even before he knew about it. When Morpheus gave him the red pill, Neo's reality didn't change. His understanding of the reality that had been there all along changed.
Good, we agree. In fact, this is how I view the universe under idealism. When I say that realism is falsified, I don't mean to say that what we called physical reality before is any different, just that physical reality is now identified as a simulation in an immaterial mind.
It assumes philosophical realism, yes, but not what I have referred to as quantum realism.
Well, it assumes a reality beyond that of observation, be that our observations or the observations of measuring apparatuses, which, assuming dualism is false, should be ontically identical to the kind of existence our observations have.
Now, if we were to add the assumption that, let's say, the universe only splits when a conscious observation is made, then that would be an unnecessary assumption. We could remove it and still have a working interpretation.
I can't distinguish between them, or else I'll end up with dualism. But yes, I agree that not all observations need to be our observations.
It's just like how we could remove the assumption that the universe is virtual, and the digital physics interpretation would still work fine. Digital does not imply virtual.
Well, if spacetime is not fundamental but emerges from information as suggested by digital physics, I don't see how that is distinguishable from what we would otherwise call a virtual reality. If you just mean that reality is quantized, then sure, but I think it's saying rather more than that. Quantization should not give us quantum weirdness, nor the idea of spacetime being emergent.
It could simply be that this is how realities work, virtual or otherwise.
Yes, but what I'm getting at is that I don't think reality could be different. I don't think otherwise could exist.
This argument doesn't work because there's a fallacy of composition in premise 2. The fact that I can doubt the existence of the parts, that is, the matter, does not mean that I must be able to doubt the existence of the whole, that is, the mind.
Let me rephrase this in another way to give you a better angle on it. I can consistently conceive of a possible world where mind exists without matter. I can't do that with matter, though. Therefore, whatever it is I'm conceiving of when I conceive of the mind cannot be material, or else I would first need to conceive of matter to conceive of it. Whatever it is that makes mind mind is such that the mind can be conceived of in isolation from matter, whereas matter cannot be conceived of in isolation from matter.
Another way to look at it is, I can be absolutely convinced that the mind exists, but still not be absolutely convinced that matter exists, if I am not absolutely certain that the mind is material.
But that would mean that you have some lack of knowledge of the conscious experience that makes up your mind. Or to put it more tellingly, that would mean that you might have some lack of consciousness of the conscious experience that makes up your mind. But notice that can't work, because that would be a contradiction in terms.
And I'm not. It's simply that I find it far more consistent with the reality I perceive than I do the opposite.
Isn't that assuming that there is a reality beyond perception, though? Because I could say in the same brain science under my own ontology that it is just as consistent with what I perceive.
Of course we don't. Nor do we have any examples of realities that we know are the products of minds.
Of course you do. When was the last time you had a lucid dream? And remember, it's question-begging to automatically assume one is real and the other is not.
But we have billions of examples of minds, and not a single one of them can be shown to exist independent of a brain.
Assuming the mind-independent reality of the brain, yes. But that is precisely the point that is up for debate. We can't use a posteriori empirical data to justify the a priori nature of the mind until we understand the a priori relationship between the mind and the sphere of empirical data that includes things like brains.
And those minds can be affected by tampering with the brain using anything from chemicals to physical trauma.
Well, that's predicted by idealism too. In fact, it fits idealism better. Since there exists a whole host of arguments in philosophy of mind for the immateriality of the mind, it would make sense that an immaterial brain and immaterial trauma, or immaterial chemicals, could interact upon an immaterial mind. However, given the interactionism problem and the a priori immateriality of the mind, it doesn't make sense how any of these things could act upon the mind if they were material.
That's not what I said. Quite the contrary, actually. I even listed space, that is, location, as a property of matter.
Let me ask you a question then. Could matter exist if it does not have a location in space? Because if not, then by your own admission, matter cannot exist before it has a defined location, before measurement.
Yes, matter occupies space, but...
Well, there you go. If matter must exist within space, and existing in space means having a location, then prior to collapse, matter doesn't exist.
But take away everything in space, and space itself, as well as time, will lose all meaning.
Then we agree. That's why spacetime has to be emergent. Space does not exist without locations of particles, and locations of particles do not exist before collapse. Thus, whatever spacetime is, it comes after collapse.
I didn't hear anything about magic. I heard that some of the mysteries in string theory are mirrored in various forms of ancient superstition.
I was trolling there, though the parallels did seem a bit curious. See, I found this while doing research for one of my sci-fi novels, and the concept of magic in Kabbalah is essentially that the world is programmed with Hebrew letters, and spells in it are the direct analog of cheat codes. I thought this concept fit in perfectly with what I had in mind for my sci-fi facsimile of magic, and so when you asked for magic, I thought I'd toss it in the video for a joke.
Johannen, it's obvious that we agree regarding the basics. We simply draw very different metaphysical conclusions, and I can't help but suspect that this has something to do with your religious beliefs and my lack thereof.
I suppose you could say that, though I have philosophic considerations too. I know sometimes people don't like it when I draw conclusions from both scientific and philosophic angles at once, but, and maybe this is just because I minored in philosophy, I think to get to the larger picture you have to triangulate things from both angles at once.
What bothers me is that you seem to think that this is a done deal simply because experts A, B, and C have said X, Y, and Z, so, well, that's it.
I understand what you're saying, and believe it or not, I can appreciate that, However, as for my degree of certainty, it's possible that there's more to it than that. It's hypothetically possible that I had run into something that would make me more certain than would be the case were it merely a religious or philosophic, or even for that matter a scientific motivation. Of course, if something like that were the case, then I probably wouldn't say either, which I suppose could be a problem if it made me appear over-certain. But I'll just shut up now.
In science, as you well know, the accuracy of a model is not determined by who said what, but by whether the predictions made by the model are useful and hold up to attempts to falsify them. It's going to be hard, if not impossible, to figure out which philosophical interpretation of quantum mechanics is the right one, or at least the best one, until one actually makes a unique, useful, falsifiable prediction. And I guess at that point it's not really philosophy anymore, it's actually science.
Well, let me make a suggestion. Look at the stuff on emergent spacetime. I know it's not determined what quantum gravity approach is correct yet, but look at them both, and tell me if you think spacetime is emergent, just as a personal opinion or not. Because it looks like at least that part of the picture is a done deal, regardless of which of the two theories works out best. Also, look at the hard problem of consciousness and think about the only ways you can conceive of it being solved. And then take a step back and look at the big picture and think about what fits the best. And I'm not saying this in terms of you espousing only all the details of what you think has officially been agreed upon or not, but rather what you yourself as a person think makes the most sense and where you think the big picture is going. Well, I don't want you to get sick again, so I won't give you any more headaches by trolling you with more magic physics. But I hope you're better, and I will talk to you later. And that's that. See ya. If you liked this video, subscribe. And don't forget to check out my novel, Alaris, The Lances of Light, on Amazon Kindle in the description below. Now you can find us on Facebook at Idealism and Science versus Atheism. This mind is the matrix of all matter.